Start with our first keynote, which links intimate partner violence to online misogyny and also shows some interventions. The keynote will be on online misogyny and abuse, impacts, links to intimate partner violence, youth perspectives, and educational interventions by Debbie Ging. It is a recorded keynote. Debbie is a professor of digital media and gender at Dublin City University and director of the DCU Institute for Research on Genders and Sexualities. She teaches and researches on gender, sexuality, and digital media with a focus on digital hate, online anti-feminist, men's rights politics, the incel subculture, and radicalisation of boys and men into male supremacist ideologies. So it is a recorded keynote, and we will start it now.
So the title of my presentation today is Post-Digital Toxic Technocultures, Ecosystems of Online Abuse and Real-World Sexual and Gender-Based Violence. A bit of a mouthful. And in this presentation, I propose that digital abuse has become instrumental to the dynamics of male violence against women, importantly at both the personal and political levels. And I'm going to try and explain how post-digital toxic technocultures have managed to blur the boundaries in very important ways between the personal and the political, and between the offline and the online. So, as we are all well aware, unfortunately, both online and real-world violence against women and girls are on the rise in recent years. Online misogyny and anti-feminism have been steadily increasing, and in tandem with this, there has been a concerning increase in the incidence of sexual and gender-based harassment in schools and among youth in Europe and beyond. In Ireland, in 2020, a Women's Aid study found that 1 in 5 women aged between 18 and 25 have experienced intimate relationship abuse, and half of the young women abused by a partner also experienced online abuse, including the non-consensual taking or sharing of images. In 2024, a WHO report, which is reported here on the UN website, revealed that adolescent girls are more at risk of intimate partner violence than adult women. This is a statistic that I found really quite shocking, but in other ways not surprising in the context of what we're going to be looking at today. So by the time they're 19 years old, almost 1 in 4 adolescent girls, or 24%, who have been in a relationship have already been physically, sexually, or psychologically abused by a partner. There's also been a concerning increase in the incidence of sexual and gender-based harassment in schools in the UK, in Ireland, and beyond, as I mentioned before. So in 2021, Ofsted's review in the UK of sexual abuse in schools and colleges revealed some really alarming levels of harmful sexual behaviours. On the right here, you can see the percentages of female participants who said these types of harmful sexual behaviours happened a lot or sometimes between people their age. So these are pretty high statistics, as you can see. In tandem with this, in recent years, we have seen the manosphere grow in both size and impact, largely due to the ways in which it has become increasingly mainstreamed and commercialised. So this online ecosystem of men's rights groups began in very niche subcultural online spaces like 4chan and various subreddits. But over the past 10 years, it has migrated onto dedicated platforms. It has grown. And it is now operating on really mainstream spaces, social media spaces like TikTok and YouTube. So 10 years ago, when I began researching this community, it was much easier to locate and draw lines around the different groups of the manosphere. Incels, involuntary celibates, traditional conservatives, pickup artists, men going their own way, and men's rights activists were the main kinds of groups that I was able to identify. Since then, however, the manosphere, or what we've called in a recent article, the neo-manospheres, have become much more fluid, much more heterogeneous, both within the manosphere ecosystem and across other similar spaces. Male supremacist groups and influencers are now operating on X widely, and like I said, on popular mainstream platforms like TikTok and YouTube, where they have been vastly amplified by the algorithms of these platforms and by the rise of influencer culture. So if we look just briefly at a recent study that we conducted in DCU in 2023, it was published in 2024, this shows the extent to which this kind of content is being recommended to boys and men. So it's an experimental study. We set up fake or sock puppet accounts for 16 and 18-year-old male male accounts, not real people, to show the extent to which this content is being recommended. And we had two types of accounts for each age group and on each platform. One was a kind of regular, kind of gender stereotypical straight guy, and the other was manosphere curious. So they were actively looking for anti-feminist content. The kind of regular guy is just looking for gym tips and soccer and this kind of stuff. And we found that all of the accounts, whether they sought out manosphere content or generic male interest content, were fed male supremacist, misogynistic, or other forms of toxic content within the first 26 minutes of the experiment, but some were recommended this content much more quickly, in one case in the first 2 minutes of engagement. So in the case of the YouTube Shorts accounts, 61.5% of the total recommended content was toxic by the end of the experiment. In the case of the TikTok accounts, 34.7% of the total recommended content was toxic. And you can see here that Andrew Tate, even though he was banned from both of these platforms at the time of data collection, features really highly in the content that was recommended to the phones. The quantity of manosphere and toxic content also increased exponentially. So by the last round of the experiment, the vast majority of the content being recommended to the phones was toxic. 76% on TikTok and 78% on YouTube Shorts, primarily falling into either alpha male or anti-feminist categories. And we also found in this and in other research that the manosphere has become much more ideologically diverse, so it's overlapping more with far right. That was the other kind of toxic content. We captured conspiracy content and anti-trans and anti-vax communities. It's also become more ethnically diverse, and we now see the emergence of the Black manosphere in shows like Fresh and Fit, podcast shows, for example, and accounts. And it has also integrated high-profile anti-woman influencers and galvanized what's known as the tradwife movement. So we see here on the right, Hannah Pearl-Davis, a very prominent anti-feminist influencer who's very wrapped up in the contemporary manosphere. So in brief, it has moved away from its subcultural political origins to become an overwhelmingly commercial space, which recruits followers under the guise of offering advice about fitness, mental health, and money making, and really problematic advice, needless to say. Perhaps most importantly, it has coalesced with the strongman politics and the new tech oligarchs in alarming ways. Male supremacist influences are now key figures in the new techno-feudalist world order. So on the left here, we see a poster. This is a fictional or fantasy image. It's a poster that you can buy on Amazon. But on the right, this is, realistic contemporary politics. And this is the way in which these figures are unifying in very, very significant ways. So for a while, it was difficult to prove a direct causal link between rising rates of violence against women and girls and the rise of the manosphere. Laura Bates called it out in 2021 in her book, Men Who Hate Women, but there was still a lack of hard evidence. And we're only really beginning now to properly understand the ways in which the manosphere and its anti-woman ideologies are reaching out to boys and young men. and most importantly, impacting young people's gendered and sexual dynamics. So we're hearing it a lot from teachers. They're telling us that girls are being deepfaked by boys in school contexts, and bear in mind that 96% of all deepfake images are pornographic in nature, and that 99% of those feature women. Female teachers are being disrespected in the classroom, they're being sexually harassed, they're hearing Tate's slogans and talking points become commonplace in the classroom, in the schoolyard, etc. So this work from Stephen Roberts and Stephanie Westcott in particular has been really instrumental in bringing to light the detail and the extent of the impact of masculinity influences in Australian schools. This is in the Australian context. There's really, really important work going on there. And we are also hearing accounts from young people themselves in various reports. So a Women's Aid report in Ireland, no, sorry, actually, I think it's a UK report in 2023, showed that those who have viewed misogynistic content online, including from influencers like Andrew Tate, are 5 times more likely to view hurting somebody physically as acceptable, provided you say sorry afterwards. The report also finds that worrying behaviours indicative of controlling behaviour, such as love bombing, stalking, giving unwanted gifts, are increasingly being normalized by those who have been exposed to harmful content online. And a recent report from the SERP Institute in Ireland also alludes to the impact that pornography is having on women and girls' real lives, real relationships, and real experiences of sex. And so this is really important evidence that is emerging increasingly from the research. And in some ways it's unsurprising, given the way in which the sexual objectification, dehumanization and subjugation of women are being constantly normalized in the feeds of boys and men. So typically, what starts out as, fairly harmless, well, maybe not, but, relatively innocuous dating advice, very soon segues into women want to be dominated, women love violence, this kind of content. So the algorithm isn't just feeding them more of the same content, it's feeding increasingly extreme content to male accounts. And after a while, this doesn't really appear shocking anymore because 1, it's gradual, 2, it's relentless. They're being fire hosed with this kind of content all the time. And 3, it's couched in the pseudo-scientific language of evolutionary psychology, which purports that this kind of attraction to violent or dark triad personalities is part of the natural order, that women are genetically attracted to these kinds of men because they will be able to protect them. So they're using pseudoscience to not just to normalize, but to validate this kind of content. Meanwhile, girls and GPs are telling us now that the sexual scripts prescribed by the manosphere and by porn are an everyday reality of sex, including strangulation. And we're seeing very, very clear links here between the manosphere, pornography, and real sexual practices. Young women in particular are terrified of being labelled frigid or vanilla if they don't engage in these practices, and there's always the threat then of rumours being spread about them on social media. But they're also terrified of what will happen to intimate images of themselves if they do engage in certain practices. And if this sounds familiar, it's because it is. It's the age-old virgin-whore dichotomy, but it's now on algorithmic steroids. So I think the first major point that we can draw from all of this is that the digital and material phenomena that we're talking about here are interwoven in really complex ways. And for this reason, I suggest we need to rethink how we conceptualize the offline and the online, because the distinction isn't really tenable or useful anymore. If, for example, if you're being geo-tracked by a controlling partner, it's not some disembodied online experience. You're being stalked in material physical space, you're being surveyed, and you feel that you're being surveyed. If the police are breaking down your door because you've been swatted, and that's the term that refers to prank calls to emergency and police services, this is not a disembodied online experience. It's a form of misogynistic terrorism that's increasingly being used against individual women. So digital abuse goes far beyond anonymous verbal trolling on social media comment threads. You know, we're talking about doxing, deepfake porn, nudify apps, upskirting. These are all deeply invasive acts that blur the boundaries between what is digital and what is embodied. They have physical and emotional impacts as well as material consequences. So women lose their jobs, they retreat from public office and public debate, they're forced to move address, and they may, in many cases, develop severe psychological issues. But this doesn't just relate to individual or one-on-one relationships. As Stephen Albrecht and colleagues have pointed out, the digital is not simply used by the far right as a means of communicating with other humans. It's an intricate part of its fabric and feeling. In the same way, I would argue that the digital is an intricate part of the manosphere's fabric and feeling, and it is increasingly intrinsic to the ways in which gender-based and sexual violence are carried out. So I find the concept of the post-digital is useful here in describing how digital and non-digital worlds have become basically indistinguishable. The post-digital describes how the digital is so often invisible and so often kind of naturalized in how we think, how we act, how we feel, how we engage. And it pushes us to focus on what it means to be human in a digital world. And I like that perspective more than offline, online, that idea of focusing instead, or refocusing and reframing around human experience. The human experience of various technocultures, I think, is probably a more useful way to think about tech-facilitated gender-based and sexual violence. So the second major point then I want to make is that this brings us, going back to this horrible poster, this brings us to the broader political context. And I think that the broader political context is really essential for us to fully understand what's going on. So obviously, while misogyny and sexual and gender-based violence have existed as long as patriarchy, I would argue that the current political, economic, and technological conjuncture is somewhat unique. Despite significant progress made in the last 100 years or so, we're now witnessing a global backlash against liberalism and the left. And many of these forces also own or control the technologies that connect and inform us. And so male supremacism is deeply embedded in the ideologies of the alt-right and the far right, who maintain that Western masculinity is under threat from non-white immigrants. And as we move into a new economic phase, that of techno-capitalism, we're witnessing an orchestrated attempt to return the Western world, at least, to an ethno-nationalist heteropatriarchy. So to quote my colleague, Professor Eugenia Sayapera, misogyny is not so much a sentiment as it is a strategy used in times of structural crisis to exclude women from accessing and controlling the means of production and from full socio-economic participation. And I think that's a really important point to kind of keep hold of, is that misogyny is a strategy more than it is a sentiment, and to keep that kind of broader picture in mind. But moving on now from this kind of wider lens, let's focus back in on young people and return to that statistic based on the WHO report about adolescent girls. Why are they more at risk of intimate partner violence than adult women? Why is this? How can this be? And I think, well, maybe it's not the only way we can make sense of it, but for me, one of the ways that we can make sense of this is by acknowledging that we live now in a society in which, one, boys and young men are feeling angrier, more threatened and more disentitled than before. And two, violence against women and girls is becoming more normalized through the content that I've already presented, through the manosphere, through violent pornography, but also through a world in which violence generally is becoming more normalized. So again, we have to look at this kind of the broader picture of a more violent world in which the gap between rich and poor is ever widening. And with regard to the first, I think there's compelling evidence to show that rates of anxiety, stress, and depression are increasing among children and young people. And the reasons for this are obviously very complex and they're beyond the scope of this presentation. However, it's clear that the fears and anxieties of boys and men are being manipulated and weaponized in very, very specific ways. Unemployment, housing affordability, loneliness, low self-esteem, all of which are attributable in one way or another to neoliberal capitalism, its creation of vast inequality, its erosion of workers' rights, and its obsessive focus on individualism, consumerism, and physical appearance are blamed instead on women's rights and immigration. So at the same time, it's true that white male privilege has been both visibilized and challenged in important ways, a development that makes many men feel uncomfortable or threatened. So that's, you know, a kind of dangerous combination of events in many ways. Meanwhile, there's been a very significant shift in how we do politics, with digital activism facilitating a move away from the collective towards the personal, the more individual, from the political to the cultural, from the material to the affective, to politics of feeling and emotion. If we add algorithmic manipulation to this equation, we have the perfect conditions for curating a highly personalized, what Sarah Ahmed calls politics of emotion, into people's social media feeds, sowing division, spreading disinformation, and ultimately dismantling the public sphere and democracy itself. Manfluencers tell boys and men that their anger is justified while selling them a steady stream of life coaching on fitness, mental health, and money making. Related to this, and with regard to the second point, one of the most significant characteristics of the contemporary manosphere is its proclivity for personalized attacks on individual women, something that was not a feature of pre-internet men's rights politics. So men's rights activists have both humiliated and dehumanized individual women, and through algorithmic amplification and curation, reinforced these actions, these discourses, these images as representative of all women. So I would argue that it is this highly personalized politics of emotion, more than anything else, that has effectively bridged the gap between anti-feminism and misogyny as a political project and personal violence against women. It has emboldened strongman politics, it has emboldened far-right activists, and it has emboldened masculinity influencers alike to publicly promote physical violence, sexual assault, and the subjugation of women. Their sordid relationships are no longer a source of shame, but a badge of honour. So given all this, what can we do? What kinds of interventions are going to be helpful? And I've been doing some work in schools and with youth groups on how to address this issue over the past year or so. It's a learning curve. I've been finding Lewis Wedlock's Masculinities in Schools book very useful. I'll include it in the references if anybody wants a copy of the slides. Beyond Equality in the UK are also a really brilliant organisation working in this space. So for many people, the most obvious response is to jump in the deep end, to educate boys about the manosphere, to debunk its myths and its disinformation, to expose its reliance on pseudoscience, and to reveal the harm it causes to women and indeed to men itself. And there's a sense of, well, once they see how toxic it is, they'll stay away or they'll disengage. Of course, we have to get there at some point, but I would argue this is not the starting point. It may work for some boys, but for many, the manosphere is not perceived as the pernicious space that we see it as. Most boys aren't familiar with the complex backstories of feminism and anti-feminism, and they see masculinity influencers as offering genuine and useful advice. Don't forget that they're surrounded constantly by the ambient hum of discourses about lost boys, boys being left behind, girls doing better, male loneliness epidemic, etc. And as far as they're concerned, these figures are responding to those very real problems. So they offer advice on how to be successful, how to not get bullied, how to be attractive to girls, how to get rich. And they appeal, especially and very deliberately, to boys who aren't doing well in school. So for some, the manosphere isn't particularly serious either. It's a signifier of rebellion, a source of cultural capital, a way to kind of gain kudos in your peer group. But for others, it does appear to be, or they feel that it is responding to genuine needs for solidarity and companionship, or for improved self-esteem. So rather than telling boys, you know, this is all bad, stay away from it, we need to start asking boys what they think of it, and most importantly, why they are attracted to it or not, as the case may be, and to listen, to actively listen to what they may say, even though a lot of what they may say is very problematic. We still need to give them that space to get it out, to put it on the table, and then we can start working with it. Most importantly, though, I think we have to start with conversations about masculinity, what it is, where and how different forms of masculinity are learned, why one type is prioritized above all others, why that type is limiting and harmful to boys themselves as well as to others, and how and why violence is normalized, what patriarchy is, for example, what patriarchy does, and what it takes to exist outside the man box. Obviously, this work is a lot more difficult than simply debunking manosphere myths, but it provides us with a much more solid foundation on which to critically assess the claims of manfluencers and the manosphere later on. In addition to this, one size doesn't fit all. The issues and pressure points in different schools, in different social classes, different ethnic groups, etc., different cultural spaces are very different. And we have to, you know, we have to pivot, we have to recalibrate around those differences. And that is work that requires time. And again, I would recommend Lewis Wedlock's book here, Masculinities in School, for anyone involved in this kind of work, because he really digs into the challenges that are involved in doing this kind of work, in particular emphasizing that one-off assemblies or assembly talks won't do it, and that if schools recognize this as a problem, they need to make real space and real time to deal with it holistically. And we know, of course, the problem is that schools don't have the time and often are themselves implicated in fostering problematic forms of masculinity. So Wedlock deals with all these issues and puts them out, lays them out on the table, and suggests ways of working through them. Personally, I would advocate a much more radical transformation, as I'm sure many people would, of the entire education system, with mandatory philosophy as a tool of inquiry across all subjects from a very young age. But that's not going to happen today or tomorrow. I would also probably get rid of single-sex schooling, which is still quite prevalent in Ireland. In the meantime, however, there are more pragmatic and actionable measures that can be put in place. For example, make modules on gender studies and critical digital literacy mandatory on all third-level teacher training degree programs, both primary and second-level teacher education. Invest heavily in training teachers. Organizations exist who can outsource this training if we're willing to invest in it. Call boys into the conversation, listen to them, equip them to become critically literate digital creators as well as consumers so that they have a voice. So I think creativity is really important as well. Invest in youth groups and other spaces for boys and men besides sport that enable them to forge positive friendships with one another, to nurture creativity, and most importantly, to develop empathy. Continue to demand that the social media companies remove addictive design and recommender algorithms from their products. Safety by design must become the standard, and continue to lobby for stricter laws on image-based sexual abuse, deepfake technology, nudify apps, etc. So to conclude, Extremely powerful forces are deliberately and strategically tapping into boys' anger, anxieties, low self-esteem, but whether that's manufactured or real, all things that paradoxically result from the extreme fragility of hyperpatriarchal or toxic masculinity. And the current economic and political system enthusiastically supports this. So the closing of the gap between political anti-feminism and interpersonal misogyny and gender-based and sexual violence is a very significant feature, I would argue, of the current war on gender equality and on women and girls. And we need to tackle it at all levels on the ground: educational, legal, technological, political, while constantly keeping in our sights the bigger picture, the bigger political picture. In other words, to significantly ramp up local, national, and transnational resistance to the far right and anti-feminism in whatever ways we can. Thank you.